The mountains changed in a matter of minutes. My two best friends and I were making a steady descent down the rocky slope when the fog rolled up from the deep gorges. It wasn't a natural mountain mist. It was an abnormally thick, suffocatingly white wall that swallowed the landscape in an instant, deafening all sound and erasing the path beneath my boots. The air grew heavy, sticky, and unnaturally cold, sinking straight to my bones. Disoriented and fighting a rising tide of panic, we wandered blindly, the GPS useless, the compass spinning wildly in my hand. We walked for what felt like hours until dark, jagged silhouettes finally pierced the white veil. It was an old, forgotten settlement, a cluster of sagging wooden cabins built from heavy timber, seemingly assembled without a single iron nail. Their windows were crooked and blind. A dead, heavy silence hung over the place. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, no distant cry of a bird. Only the hollow creak of rotting floorboards beneath our feet. On the porch of the largest cabin, the hosts were already waiting. An elderly man and woman gestured for us to come inside, their movements impossibly smooth. They didn't speak a word of greeting. Inside, the cabin was warm, but it did not smell of burning firewood or a cooked meal. Instead, the air was thick with the cloying, nauseating stench of damp earth, ancient moss, and something sweet and decaying, like rotten roots. They bustled around the heavy wooden table, their faces stretched into wide static smiles that looked entirely forced. It was only when I sat down that the primal, twisting discomfort in my gut crystallized into sheer terror. I realized what was wrong with them. They did not blink. Their eyes remained stretched wide open, dry and glassy, fixed on us with a predatory intensity, as if terrified of missing a single breath we took. Dinner passed in a suffocating silence. Glancing around, I noticed the cabin lacked any reflective surfaces, no mirrors, no polished metal. Even the water in our clay mugs seemed strangely matte, refusing to catch the light of the kerosene lamp. Then, the flame flickered. I stared at the soot-stained wall and felt a cold sweat break out across my neck. The old man was sitting perfectly still at the head of the table, but his shadow on the wall slowly raised a long, impossibly hooked finger, pointing directly at my friend. Exhaustion eventually overpowered our dread, and the three of us lay down to sleep in a single cramped room. I was the last to drift off, feeling the weight of an unseen heavy gaze boring into me from the pitch-black hallway. In the dead of night, a sound ripped me from my uneasy sleep. It was a sickening, wet squelching coming from the courtyard outside. The heavy slap of something moving through thick mud. I sat up slowly, my breath catching in my throat. I looked at the beds next to mine. They were empty. The blankets were tossed aside. Their backpacks and boots were gone. A cold, animalistic panic gripped me. Moving on, agonizingly silent tiptoes, I slipped out of the room, unlatched the heavy wooden door, and stepped out into the freezing night. The pale moonlight barely penetrated the dense fog, but what it revealed was enough to shatter my reality. Standing in the courtyard, ankle deep in the freezing, churning black muck, were the old hosts, and right beside them stood my friends. They were barefoot, their postures rigid and wrong, their limbs hanging at took a hesitant step forward, a desperate urge to call out to them welling in my chest, hoping this was just some bizarre nightmare. But then, they slowly turned to face me. Their movements were jerky, accompanied by a wet, sickening crackle, like dry branches snapping under thick mud. The woman who had been my friend looked at me. Her skin was a lifeless, ashen gray, spiderwebbed with tiny pulsing cracks. She stared at me with wide, unblinking dead eyes. When she spoke, her voice was completely devoid of emotion. A flat, synthesized drone that vibrated directly into my skull. You shouldn't be here. You are not him. You are just a filthy imitation. Beside her, my other friend took a shuddering step forward. His jaw unhinged and dropped with a wet, tearing sound. Instead of words, a thick, viscous stream of foul black earth poured from his mouth, tumbling over his chest as he gurgled, "We haven't finished molding you yet." Behind them, I saw the old man holding a shapeless lump of wet, black clay. With methodical, horrifying precision, he was pressing a familiar tuft of hair into a freshly sculpted, featureless head that was already beginning to twitch. Pure, unadulterated terror exploded in my veins. I didn't scream. I spun around, lunging back into the darkness of the cabin. But I didn't stop to hide. Using my momentum, I threw my entire weight against the rotting wooden frame of the back window. The brittle wood splintered, the glass shattered, and I tumbled violently out into the suffocating abyss of the fog. I ran blindly. Jagged branches whipped across my face, tearing my clothes and slicing my skin. But the adrenaline masked the pain. Behind me, the night erupted into a cacophony of horrific sounds. It wasn't the thud of human footsteps pursuing me, but the heavy, wet slapping of mud against stone, accompanied by shrill, snapping shrieks that sounded like trees being torn out by their roots. The fog was an impenetrable white wall. I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. I didn't know if I was running towards safety or deeper into a trap. The wet, tearing sounds were closing in from all sides, surrounding me, practically breathing down my neck. My lungs burned. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I pushed my body far past its limits, fueled entirely by the raw instinct to survive. Suddenly, the white wall broke. I burst out of the fog line, like a drowning man breaking the surface of the water, stumbling onto cold, dry grass, bathed in sharp moonlight. I ran for a few more desperate meters before my legs gave out completely. I collapsed onto the frozen earth, my chest heaving in violent spasms, absolutely incapable of taking another step. Hearing the wet, squelching steps relentlessly approaching the edge of the clearing, I forced myself to roll over and look back, fully expecting the muddy, cold hands to tear into my flesh. But they had stopped. My friends, the old couple, and the unfinished things of clay stood exactly on the razor-sharp boundary where the unnatural fog met the clear night air. They did not take a single step onto the moonlit grass. They just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, their bodies twisted in grotesque, broken postures. They didn't scream or reach for me. They simply stared at me. Their wide, dry, unblinking eyes were locked onto me with a dead, relentless patience. The sheer, quiet horror of their silent vigil overloaded my exhausted mind. The world tilted dizzily, the edges of my vision went black, and darkness mercifully took me. When I finally drifted back to consciousness, the sky was bleeding into the pale, freezing gray of dawn. The cold had seeped deep into my bones, and my muscles screamed in agony as I forced myself to sit up. The memories of the night crashed into my skull. Trembling, I slowly raised my head and looked back toward the tree line, praying to God it had all been a hallucination. My breath caught in my throat. The wall of fog was still there, a dense white barrier against the morning light, and they were still there, standing in the exact same spots, in the exact same twisted postures, immobile as statues, waiting, and their dead, unblinking eyes were still staring directly at me.